Guys, it's Anders, and in today's video I want to have a talk about mastering for streaming services and give you guys a checklist of the things you need to do and just compare it to the kind of old hat methods that were taught for a changing industry. Let's get into it.
No deal, I'm Jaws on the beat, I got flow that kills. Do my thing with a few G's, Lauren Hill.
So recently I put out a video called Should You Master Your Own Music? And essentially what we got down to was, yeah, with all the tools we've got available to us nowadays, you absolutely can, and in some cases, when it's right for you, you should master your own music. It's completely possible to get the result you're after and the results you're seeking. However, we got a few questions around not necessarily misinformation, but just a changing industry in that how are we gonna do this specifically for the streaming platforms? And do we go and do 12 different masters to go on Deezer, Google Play, Spotify, etc., etc.? And the answer really is no. What we do is we do the best possible scenario for all of them. Now, in some cases, we might want to do a specific version, and the cases I can think of right now would be Tidal and now Apple Music. They now both do a completely lossless option. So what we might want to do, lossless release that we only put out to Apple Music and Tidal, where we could master things slightly differently. We could go a little bit higher on the headroom and obviously just change some of the things we're going to talk about in today's video. What I'm personally going to be doing is keeping everything under that one release, getting a really good master that I know sounds right on lots of different systems and sounds right regardless of any degrade in format. The reason for that is people who stream Spotify can stream in 128 through to 320 kbps. People on Apple Music, if they're listening on their phone or over Bluetooth headphones, is still a compressed 256 kilobits per second file. If I'm listening on something like the computer here, then I'm able to stream that lossless format. So I still want to release something that I know is going to work across the whole gambit until everywhere moves to something like lossless, and we're back at CD Redbook standard. And speaking of releasing your music on all platforms, the channel sponsor Distrokid is the perfect way for you to release your music to all of the streaming platforms fast, efficiently, and perfectly in line with an independent artist's budget. Check out the discount in the link below. All right, so point number one that we want to talk about is levels and LUFS. Now, when I first learned about finalizing my mix and getting things ready for mastering, we used something called RMS, which is roots mean squared. And this was great for Redbook audio, which Redbook audio was the standard you wanted to meet for a CD duplication. We don't really do this too much anymore unless you're specifically still putting things out to a CD. We now use LUFS, and most platforms have a LUFS target that they go for. Now, in my most recent video, I showed you how I was going for an integrated LUFS, and there's some certain standards, but integrated LUFS is going to be good enough in most cases for you. And across the entirety of the track, so start to finish, we want to get an average of about -14 LUFS. Now, I use this as a standard because it's Spotify standard. However, YouTube, Apple Music, Google Play, I believe, all use slightly different targets, but I go for the most popular platform, the one where I get the most listens, to kind of adhere to that. We need to be clear that we're measuring the whole track. If you've got maybe little bits of silence, take those out totally, but we want the whole track, and it's integrated LUFS over time. We're not taking the loudest part of the track and trying to get that to be -14, because later when you've got your ambient breakdown with minimal vocals and your pan flute, whatever the hell you're doing, it's going to drastically shift that balance overall. So we're doing integrated across the entire track, okay? Now there's some tools that can be really useful to give you an idea if you are getting this right. What I did was the master that I did in the previous video, and I'll link that below if you haven't watched it, I put into this particular platform so we can have a quick look at that. So I'll make sure this website is linked below for you, and it shows you the loudness penalties of your track. So I did that master and I aimed for that -14 LUFS, right? And this shows you how the different platforms might adjust it. As you can see here, YouTube, Spotify, Tidal, and Amazon, as well as Deezer, would all turn my track down. Deezer being the larger example. And this is what I said about different platforms using different measurements, all right? So they would all turn it down by just over half a decibel. It's a really tiny incremental change. Now iTunes, and it has a little asterisk next to it, it's an estimate, and to be honest, they're all estimates. iTunes, it says it's bang on, so that's fine, which means Apple Music, it would be bang on as well. Pandora, it would actually go up 0.1 of a decibel. So what do we know from that? Well, we know that really we're right in the ballpark of where we want to be. There's going to be minimal adjustments of less than 1 decibel across all of our master, because we use that -14 integrated LUFS across the whole track. And we used compression and everything, controlled it to just make sure it didn't fluctuate too wildly, but we've still kept our dynamics and we've still kept our headroom. And that's going to be one of our next talking points. So headroom, when we're mastering for streaming services, there's a couple of different standards, okay? And we need to understand our limiting, we need to understand our averages, and we also need to understand our different codec types. Now, I use iZotope's Ozone, and that has a fantastic codec option in it, which allows me to check out different codecs and different bit rates and whether or not there'll be some kind of clipping option. It also has something called true peak limiting. If you need to learn a bit more about true peak limiting, I did an in-depth dive with a limiting and a limiter called Butte, which I'll link below so you can learn really why that's important and how that works without making this video 4 hours long. Now, Apple recommends 2 decibels of headroom when converting to AAC formats, whereas Spotify recommends we leave 1 decibel of headroom. If we looked at my master, I left 0.3 decibels of headroom. Technically on the limiter, right? However, kind of, but not. So my limiter, which was set to never exceed -0.3, actually only got touched 2 or 3 times during the entire course of my master. My actual average headroom was 2 to 3 decibels across the whole track. That 0.3 I put in there was very simply a control, just in case a couple of those extra peaks that kind of crept up, or that something that could occur because of true peak degradation of the file. So going from the 24-bit 8,200 kilohertz, etc., down to 128 kilobits per second MP3 file, that could cause issues. It's there as a fail-safe for that with true peak on. But the overall average peak really for me is much, much lower. When we test different codecs and listen to the areas where the limiters may be getting touched, that would let us know if some distortion was occurring, and digital clipping is not a pleasant sound. You would definitely hear it. So meaning that we just take the limiter down to 2 decibels and then things are always touching the limiter, that's going to take all the dynamics and all of the transients away in our track. It's definitely not what we want to do. But we do want to make sure there is consistent headroom there for that conversion process. And as you see, the platform would then either bring the track down or lift it up, or in my case for Apple, just leave it bang flat, which is perfect. So I hope that kind of clears that up. We don't just want to take a limiter and bring it down -2 and then have it always hitting that limiter. It's going to destroy the overall track. I would rather we used some very subtle compression, bring the limiter down a little bit less and make sure we've got a natural headroom there. And the limiter section is just there as a fail-safe against those extras that might just try and creep through. And the last thing to look at is dither. Now, I'll link some articles below from iZotope, who did a really great basically blog post on when to dither and why to dither. But essentially, the dither side only needs to come in when you are reducing the bit rate of your track, okay? Now, if you think about this very, very simply, I export my track at, say, 24 bits, all right? That gives a huge dynamic range and loads of data. It gives us a really large file, but my master file wants that. If I've got a particularly quiet bit and then we go to some really loud transient drums, we've got a huge dynamic range. We want to use the 24-bit audio to really calculate that. Now, when we go down to my master file, I drop a master file to 16-bit 44.1. That is CD quality, essentially. So that's where we are with that. That reduction in bitrate needs dithering to basically cover up any kind of dynamic compression or bitrate change that can happen between going through those two, okay? We've got lots of data from our 0 headroom all the way down with 24-bit. We've got much less data, although considerably higher quality than MP3 when we're going the other way. Dither adds a really kind of balanced level of noise that you don't generally hear, but does add a little bit of character depending on your audio to that, to kind of hide that process. Don't dither your bounce and then dither your master, and then if you're doing extra versions, it's going to get dithered again in those conversion points, right? That would stack up all the noise. It brings our noise floor up, especially if we've bounced tracks and audio and dithered those as well. So in some cases you might have written a synth, bounced and dithered the synth, which has added a layer of noise to it. You then bounced your master mix and dither that adds that same noise profile, if you haven't changed it, to your bounce. And then you're gonna dither your master. So you've added 3 layers of noise on top of each other. As you know, when you layer noises on top of each other, they're exactly the same. They just get louder and louder exponentially. So we don't want to do that. We just want to be dithering at that final stage when there's a reduction of bit rate. One of the most important things. I hope, guys, that's cleared up all of your questions. If not, more questions down below, and I can keep doing this kind of format. I look forward to seeing you in the next one.